The dining room at Kane Tower had never felt this cold, not even in the dead of a Manhattan January. And Elena Kane understood the moment her father set down his wine glass without drinking from it that this dinner had never been about celebration. 12 place settings gleamed under the chandelier, but only 3 chairs were occupied. Hers, her father's, and Daniel's, sitting stiff and quiet at the far end, like a man who already knew the verdict before the trial began. Arthur Kane did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply reached into his breast pocket, withdrew a folded document, and slid it across 40 feet of imported mahogany until it stopped precisely in front of his daughter's plate. "Sign it," he said, "or leave this family tonight." Elena's hand trembled as she unfolded the paper and found her name printed beneath a single brutal sentence. Renunciation of inheritance, effective upon her marriage to Daniel Hale. She looked up at her father, searching his face for some flicker of the man who used to carry her on his shoulders through the Hamptons' house, and found only a stranger in a $3,000 suit, his jaw set like poured concrete. "You would do this," Elena said quietly, "over a man who fixes water treatment systems for a living?" Arthur's eyes didn't move from hers. "I would do this," he answered, "over a man who has nothing, Elena. No name, no lineage, no future I can trace. You think love survives on rent money and second-hand furniture? I built this family out of nothing, so you would never have to know what nothing feels like. And you want to walk back into it." Somewhere down the table, Daniel shifted, and the small sound of his chair against the floor seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He said nothing. That was the strangest part to Elena, not that her father was cruel, she had braced for cruelty, but that Daniel, the man who talked for hours about municipal water systems with more passion than most men reserved for their children, had gone utterly still, his jaw tight, his hand curled into a fist resting against his thigh, as if he were holding something back that had nothing to do with heartbreak at all. Elena reached for the pen her father had already placed beside the document, its cap removed, ready. Her fingers hovered over the paper. She thought of her daughter, no, not her daughter, Daniel's daughter, 6-year-old Lily with the gap-toothed grin, who called Elena Miss L, until 3 weeks ago when she'd started unprompted shortening it to Mom. She thought of the apartment above a laundromat in Queens where Daniel lived, where the radiator clanked all night, and the window didn't quite close, and how she had never once in 8 months of knowing him felt as safe as she did falling asleep on his narrow couch, with Lily's crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. She picked up the pen. Her hands did not shake anymore. "I don't need your name," she said, and signed it in one clean stroke, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper, the way tears bleed into fabric. She did not look up to see her father's reaction. She already knew what she would find there. Not sorrow, not even anger. Satisfaction. The quiet, terrible satisfaction of a man who believed he had just saved his daughter from a mistake, when in truth, he had only guaranteed he would be the last to know the truth. Arthur took the signed document back with 2 fingers as though it might stain him, and folded it into his jacket. "You have until midnight to remove your belongings from the penthouse," he said. "Security will assist you." He rose from the table, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man closing a business meeting, not ending a family. It was only as he turned to leave that his eyes finally landed on Daniel, sweeping over him the way a man might glance at furniture he intended to discard along with everything else. "And you?" Arthur said something colder, entering his voice now, a note Elena had never heard directed at anyone outside a boardroom. "I hope she was worth whatever you thought you were going to get out of this family." Daniel finally spoke, and his voice was low-level, entirely without the tremor Elena expected from a man who had just lost access to more money than he would see in 3 lifetimes. "I never wanted anything from your family, Mr. Kane," he said. "I only wanted her. Though I'll admit," he added so quietly that Elena almost missed it, "I never expected to end up in this particular room." The comment slid past Arthur without registering, but it caught in Elena's chest like a splinter she couldn't name. In this particular room. Not this house. Not this family. This room. As though the space itself carried some specific weight for him, some memory she had never been told. She filed the thought away as her father's footsteps faded down the hall, the heavy door to his study closing with a sound like a verdict being sealed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel exhaled, and something in his shoulders loosened, not with relief, but with the exhaustion of a man who had been holding his breath for far longer than one dinner. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair, his hand covering hers where it still rested near the empty space where the document had been. Elena looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to during dinner, too busy bracing for her father's cruelty, to notice that Daniel's own face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy. "I'm fine," she said, and mostly meant it. "I signed away $4 billion for a man who owns exactly one good coat." She meant it as a joke, something to cut through the wreckage of the evening. But Daniel's mouth didn't curve the way it usually did at her humor. Instead, he reached into his own jacket pocket and closed his hand around something small, something metal, that made a faint clinking sound against his keys. He didn't take it out. He simply held it, the way a man holds a rosary he doesn't want anyone to see him praying with. "Daniel," Elena said, watching him more carefully now. "What was that? What you said to my father? About this room?" He shook his head too quickly. "Nothing. Old habit. I get strange in fancy dining rooms. Comes from growing up eating dinner off a card table." It was a good answer. It was even, she thought, probably partially true. But it wasn't the whole truth. And 8 months of loving a man taught you the difference between his easy smile and the smile he used when he was building a wall behind it. She let it go because the night had already taken more from her than she had reserves to spend arguing over a stray comment, and because some small, self-protective part of her did not want to know what lay behind Daniel's sudden paleness on top of everything else she had lost in the last hour. They gathered what belongings fit into 2 suitcases, while a security guard named Marcus, who had known Elena since she was 9 years old, stood in the hallway, refusing to meet her eyes, his own jaw tight with an emotion he wasn't paid enough to express. At the elevator, Elena paused, looking back down the long corridor toward her father's closed study door, half expecting him to emerge to say this had all been a test, a father's clumsy way of proving his daughter's loyalty. He did not emerge. The door remained shut, a thin line of light beneath it, the only sign that Arthur Kane was still inside. Sitting, she imagined, exactly where he always sat, behind a desk, surrounded by decisions he had already made and never once doubted. The elevator doors closed, sealing her off from 31 years of a life built on marble floors and expectations she had never chosen for herself. Daniel stood beside her, silent, his reflection ghosted in the polished steel of the doors, and Elena studied it without turning her head, trying to reconcile the tired, gentle engineer she had fallen in love with against the strange stillness that had come over him at dinner. The way he'd said this particular room, like it belonged to a story he hadn't finished telling her. Somewhere in the pit of her stomach, beneath the grief of losing her father, beneath the ache of watching Marcus avoid her eyes, a smaller and colder question had begun to form, one she wasn't ready yet to ask aloud. What exactly did Daniel Hale know about this house that made his hands shake harder than hers? The apartment above the laundromat smelled like fabric softener and burnt coffee, and Elena had never loved a smell more in her life. She stood in the doorway with her 2 suitcases, watching Lily race across the small living room in mismatched socks, a crayon drawing clutched in her fist that she thrust toward Elena before either adult had said a word. "I made you a wedding present," Lily announced, as though weddings and dinners and inheritance documents were the most ordinary things in the world to a 6-year-old, which Elena supposed they were. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided yellow sun labeled in wobbly block letters, "Me, Dad, Mom." Elena knelt down and hugged the girl before the tears could catch her off guard, burying her face in Lily's hair so neither of them would see how close she was to breaking. Daniel set the suitcases down just inside the door and closed it behind them. And for a moment the 3 of them stood together in the cramped entryway of an apartment that cost less per month than Elena's old shoe collection. And it was without question the safest she had felt in years. They married 9 days later at the county clerk's office, with Lily as flower girl, and Daniel's co-worker Ruth as the only witness, besides the clerk himself, a bored man who nonetheless smiled genuinely when Daniel slid a plain gold band onto Elena's finger and said his vows in a voice that cracked once, right in the middle, on the word, always. There was no photographer, no string quartet, no 5-tier cake. There was a grocery store sheet cake with congratulations misspelled as congratulations, and Lily eating frosting directly off the knife, and Daniel laughing so hard he had to set down his plastic fork. And Elena thought, watching him, that she had never seen her father laugh like that in her entire life. Not once, not even at her own childhood birthday parties. As though joy were a currency he'd budgeted too carefully to spend freely. That night in the narrow apartment with the radiator clanking its familiar rhythm, Elena lay against Daniel's chest and told him she didn't regret the signature not for 1 second, and felt him kiss the top of her head and murmur something into her hair that sounded almost like an apology, though when she asked him to repeat it, he only said he'd told her he loved her, and she was too tired and too happy to press further. Money, however, did not care how happy they were. The reality of it arrived within 2 weeks, first as a subtle tightening around Daniel's eyes when the electric bill came, then as long nights at the kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad, numbers crossed out and rewritten in a hand growing steadily more cramped. Elena took a job at a nonprofit downtown, her first real job in her adult life, filing paperwork for affordable housing grants, at a fraction of what she used to spend on a single dinner. And she came home each night bone-tired in a way that felt strangely cleaner than the exhaustion of her old life. She learned to cook rice 5 different ways. She learned which grocery store had the best off-brand cereal for Lily's lunches. She learned, too, to notice the way Daniel sometimes disappeared into the bedroom to take phone calls, his voice dropping low and clipped, entirely unlike the warm, unhurried tone he used with her and Lily, and how he always emerged afterward looking like a man who had just set down something heavy. Work stuff. He told her the first few times she asked, and she believed him, because engineers had consultants and contracts and city permits, and because she had no reason yet to doubt the architecture of the life they were building. But there was a night, 3 weeks into the marriage, when Elena woke at 2 a.m. to find the other side of the bed empty and the apartment silent, except for a thin blade of light beneath the bathroom door. She lay still, listening, and heard Daniel's voice quiet and urgent. "I don't care what the board thinks," he was saying. "Whitfield Holdings doesn't answer to Kane Industries' timeline. We move when I say we move." A pause, then colder. "No, not yet. She doesn't know, and she's not going to know until I decide how to tell her. So keep my name off every filing that crosses a Kane Industries desk." Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with sleep. She did not move. She barely breathed. When the bathroom door opened a few minutes later, she closed her eyes and forced her breathing into the slow, even pattern of sleep, and felt Daniel slide back into bed beside her, careful not to wake her, his arm curling protectively around her waist, as though nothing at all had happened. She told herself in the days that followed that she had misheard, that exhaustion and grief over her father had conjured meaning out of half-remembered fragments of a dream. But the name would not leave her. Whitfield Holdings, turning over in her mind at odd moments while she filed grant applications, while she watched Daniel help Lily sound out words in her reading workbook, while she lay awake beside a man she had married in a county clerk's office 9 days after being disowned for loving him. She did not ask him about it. Some instinct sharper and more self-protective than curiosity told her that whatever answer he gave would either be another careful evasion or a truth she wasn't prepared to receive. And she found to her own quiet shame that she preferred not knowing to risking either. What Elena did not see, and could not have known, was the office 11 floors above a nondescript building in the Flatiron district, unmarked by any sign, accessible only by a private elevator requiring a keycard that Daniel carried alongside his house keys. Here, behind reinforced glass and a receptionist who greeted him each morning as Mr. Hale, without a flicker of recognition that his surname had once been something else entirely. Daniel Hale was not an engineer who fixed municipal water systems. He was the sole managing partner of Whitfield Holdings, a private investment vehicle that had spent the last 6 years quietly accumulating a controlling minority stake in Kane Industries through a labyrinth of shell entities that even Arthur Kane's formidable legal team had failed to trace back to a single source. The water treatment consulting was real. Daniel had built that career deliberately, patiently, over a decade, both because the work meant something to him and because it gave him a plausible, unremarkable life to disappear into, while Whitfield Holdings did its slow, silent work in the shadows of the very empire that had destroyed his family. He sat now at his desk, the city spread gray and glittering below the window. A single framed photograph angled where only he could see it from his chair. A man in his 40s, with Daniel's same square jaw, his same dark eyes, standing outside a modest office building with a sign reading Whitfield Engineering, taken the year before Arthur Kane's hostile takeover had gutted the company, driven its founder into bankruptcy, and left a 19-year-old Daniel Whitfield to watch his father die of a heart attack 11 months later in a hospital room too cheap for private care. His mother sobbing that Robert had simply stopped fighting, as though loss of a name and a legacy could kill a man as surely as any disease. Daniel had changed his surname the year he turned 21, taking his mother's maiden name, Hale, and had spent every year since building himself into someone Arthur Kane would never recognize and could never again destroy. He had never planned to fall in love with the daughter. That had not been part of any strategy, not really, though he could admit in his most honest moments that the first time he'd approached Elena at a public policy fundraiser 8 months ago, some small, unkind part of him had wondered whether her father's grief at losing her might be a fitting kind of justice. That part of him had died, quickly buried under the simpler, larger fact that he loved her. Loved the unguarded way she laughed, the way she'd knelt in a $5,000 dress the first week they met to help a stranger's child pick up scattered marbles on a sidewalk. The way she looked at Lily like the girl was already hers, before Daniel had even worked up the courage to introduce them. He loved her enough that the truth had become over 8 months an increasingly unbearable weight, a debt he owed her that grew larger the longer he failed to pay it. He picked up his phone and dialed his attorney again, the same conversation from the small hours of that morning, now conducted in daylight, with the same tired urgency. "I need 6 more months before anything becomes public," he said. The board vote on the merger clause isn't until autumn. If Kane finds out who's behind Whitfield before then, he'll restructure the entire ownership stake out from under us.
And everything my father built, everything I've rebuilt, disappears a second time. The attorney's voice, tinny through the speaker, asked a question Daniel had been asking himself for months.
And what about your wife? You're planning to keep this from her for 6 more months? Daniel closed his eyes, pressing his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. I'm planning, he said quietly, to tell her before someone else does. I just don't know how to make her understand that I never meant for the truth to cost her everything twice. That evening he came home to find Elena at the kitchen table, Lily's homework spread in front of her, an expression on her face that was almost, but not quite, casual. Hey, she said, not looking up right away. Random question. Does the name Whitfield mean anything to you? Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, though his face, trained by years of boardroom composure, betrayed nothing. Whitfield, he repeated, buying himself a half-second. Why do you ask?
Elena finally looked up, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not suspicion, exactly, but the beginning of it. The first thread pulled loose from a sweater that would eventually, inevitably, unravel entirely.
My father mentioned it once, years ago, she said slowly. Some old business rival. He said the man didn't understand how the game was played. I don't know why it stuck with me. It just felt important somehow, the way he said it.
Daniel set down his keys with careful, deliberate slowness, buying himself the seconds he needed to arrange his face into something steady.
I've never heard the name, he said, and hated himself for how easily the lie came, how smoothly 8 months of practice had prepared him for exactly this moment. Elena studied him a beat longer than comfortable, then nodded, returning her attention to Lily's spelling words.
And Daniel stood in the doorway of the only honest life he had ever built for himself, watching the first crack spread quietly through its foundation. Arthur Kane had built Kane Industries on a single, unshakable belief that control once lost was rarely regained. And so he trusted almost no one with the true architecture of his company's ownership, except Marguerite Voss, his general counsel of 22 years, a woman whose loyalty he had purchased so thoroughly and so long ago that he had stopped thinking of it as purchased at all. It was Marguerite who came to his office on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Elena's dinner table exile, with a manila folder held against her chest, like something that might bite her. "We have a problem," she said without preamble, setting the folder on his desk. "Someone has been acquiring shares through a chain of shell entities for the better part of 6 years. We only caught it because of a filing error last month, a paperwork slip that should never have happened, from a firm careful enough to avoid every other one." Arthur opened the folder, scanning the tangle of corporate names, the offshore registrations, the layered ownership structures, designed unmistakably by someone who understood exactly how Kane Industries' own legal team thought, because they had likely once thought exactly that way themselves. "How much do they control?" he asked, and his voice had gone flat in the particular way Marguerite had learned over 2 decades to recognize as danger. "Just under 19%, she said. Structured to stay below the 15% disclosure threshold until recently, when new acquisitions pushed it over. Whoever's behind this has been patient, methodical. This isn't a hostile raider looking for a quick premium on a tender offer. This is someone who's been quietly assembling a controlling position for years, waiting for something." Arthur closed the folder, his jaw working the way it did when he was solving a problem 3 moves ahead of the person across from him. "Find the name behind Whitfield Holdings," he said. "I don't care what it costs or who you have to lean on. I want a name by Friday." Marguerite hesitated, an unusual thing for her.
a woman who had built her career on never hesitating in front of Arthur Kane. "Whitfield," she repeated. "Sir, that name isn't that." Arthur's eyes snapped up sharp and sudden.
"It's a common enough name," he said too quickly. The words clipped like a door slamming before a draft could get through.
"Find who's running it. That's all I need from you." Marguerite gathered the folder and left without further comment, though the name lingered in the room after she had gone, sitting in the air like smoke that refused to clear. And Arthur sat alone at his desk for a long moment, staring at nothing.
His fingers pressed flat against the mahogany, as though bracing against a memory trying to surface uninvited. He had not thought of Robert Whitfield in years. Had trained himself, in fact, not to think of him. The same way a man trains himself not to touch a bruise long after the injury should have healed. Robert Whitfield had been an engineer first, a businessman second. The kind of man who built water treatment infrastructure across 3 states with a passion that Arthur, 25 years ago, had found almost embarrassing in its earnestness. Whitfield Engineering had been a modest company, profitable, but never spectacular, until Arthur's people identified it as an easy acquisition target during Kane Industries' aggressive expansion into municipal infrastructure contracts. The takeover had been by every legal measure clean. Undervalued shares purchased through intermediaries, a board vote engineered through proxies. Arthur's team had quietly courted for months, a bankruptcy filing that followed with almost mechanical inevitability once Whitfield's contracts were stripped away one by one. Arthur had told himself then, and for every year since, that this was simply how the game was played, that Robert Whitfield's failure to anticipate the maneuver was itself a kind of business incompetence, and that the man's subsequent heart attack 11 months after losing everything he'd built was an unfortunate but unrelated medical event. Nothing Arthur needed to carry as a debt against his own ledger. He believed this, mostly. He had believed it steadily enough to build an empire on top of the foundation the Whitfield acquisition had provided. Steadily enough to raise a daughter in a penthouse purchased partly with the momentum of that early conquest. Steadily enough that he rarely allowed himself to wonder what had become of Robert Whitfield's widow, or his son, a boy Arthur vaguely recalled seeing once at a shareholder meeting decades ago, sitting silent and furious in the back row, while his father's company was dismantled piece by piece in front of him. Arthur had not thought of that boy's face in 20 years. He found himself thinking of it now, unbidden, sitting at his desk with Marguerite's folder gone and the name Whitfield still hanging in the recycled office air. And he told himself firmly that the association meant nothing, that surnames repeated across a country of 300 million people, that whoever ran Whitfield Holdings was almost certainly no relation at all to a man Arthur had not seen or thought of in 2 decades. Across the city, in the apartment above the laundromat, Elena had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to keep a small mental ledger of Daniel's inconsistencies. She noticed now that she was watching for it, how easily he discussed corporate law with the building's landlord during a dispute over a broken water heater, using terms Elena herself had only absorbed secondhand from years of overhearing her father's business calls. She noticed how he flinched almost imperceptibly when a news segment on the kitchen radio mentioned Kane Industries' quarterly earnings, and how he changed the subject afterward, with a fluency that felt, in retrospect, too smooth to be accidental. She said nothing of any of this to Daniel directly, partly because she had no proof of anything beyond a feeling, and partly because some fragile protective part of her did not want to test the foundation of the only relationship in her life that had not so far betrayed her. It was Lily, in her wonderfully unguarded 6-year-old way, who cracked the door open further without meaning to. On a Saturday afternoon, while Elena helped the girl organize a box of old family photographs for a school project on people who matter to you, Lily pulled out a faded photograph tucked in the back of Daniel's closet, one Elena hadn't seen before.
showing a man who looked remarkably like an older, more careworn version of Daniel himself,
standing in front of a building with a sign reading, Whitfield Engineering.
"That's Grandpa Robert," Lily announced, with the casual authority of a child repeating something she'd been told once and filed away without particular weight. "Daddy doesn't like to talk about him. He gets sad." Yelena stared at the photograph, at the name stenciled clearly on the building behind the man's shoulder, and felt something cold and precise slide into place in her chest.
The way a key slides into a lock, it was always meant to fit. Whitfield. The name her father had spat out years ago with such contempt. The name Daniel had claimed just weeks earlier he'd never heard. She did not confront him that night. She told herself it was because Lily was awake doing homework at the kitchen table, and that some conversations should not happen within earshot of a child who loved both people in the argument too much to be forced to referee it. But the truth, which she admitted to herself only in the shower later that night, water running hot enough to leave her skin pink, was that she was afraid. Afraid of what shape the truth might take once she forced it into the open. Afraid that whatever Daniel had been hiding might be large enough to swallow the small, hard-won happiness she had built with him. She thought of her father's words at that final dinner. "No name, no lineage, no future I can trace," and felt a bitter, disorienting laugh rise in her throat, because it turned out Daniel had a lineage after all, one so entangled with her father's past that she could not yet see where the threads led. Only that they were pulling taut somewhere just beneath the surface of her marriage, toward a knot she suspected neither man was prepared to untie gently. Daniel, for his part, had begun to feel the walls of his careful double life narrowing with every passing week. Marguerite Voss's investigators had predictably begun circling closer to Whitfield Holdings' true ownership, and his own attorney called twice that week with escalating urgency, warning him that a filing anomaly from months earlier had left a thread visible to anyone patient enough to pull it. He sat alone in his flat-iron office late one evening, the photograph of his father angled on the desk as it always was, and allowed himself for the first time in years to imagine the conversation he had been avoiding. Not the boardroom confrontation with Arthur Kane he had spent 6 years engineering, but the quieter, more terrifying one with Elena. The one where he explained that he had married her in part as a man carrying a debt he intended to collect from her father, only to discover somewhere along the way that he wanted nothing from that debt, except to be free of it, and everything from her except her trust, which he now understood he had spent every day of their marriage slowly forfeiting. He picked up his phone that night and typed a message to Elena, then deleted it, then typed another, shorter one, then deleted that too. In the end, he sent nothing, telling himself he would explain everything in person this weekend when Lily was at her aunt's house and they had time to talk without interruption. A plan that felt, even as he made it, like another small, cowardly delay dressed up as consideration. He did not yet know that Marguerite Voss's investigators would find their answer sooner than that a single, overlooked filing from a law firm in Delaware would surface Daniel Hale's name attached to a trust once registered under Daniel Whitfield before his legal name change, and that by Monday morning, Arthur Kane would be sitting in his office with a single sheet of paper that connected at last and beyond doubt the son-in-law he had dismissed as nothing to the family he had once destroyed and never fully reckoned with. The two timelines, Daniel's quiet resolve to confess and Arthur's mounting discovery of a truth he had buried for 20 years, were now racing toward each other with a momentum neither man controlled, and somewhere caught between them unaware of exactly how close the collision had become. Elena Kane lay awake beside her husband, staring at the ceiling, turning her mother-in-law's name over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. Marguerite Voss did not enjoy delivering bad news, but she had learned over 22 years that Arthur Kane preferred it delivered plainly, without cushioning.
And so she walked into his office that Monday morning and set a single sheet of paper on his desk without sitting down first. "The trust behind Whitfield Holdings," she said, "was registered 11 years ago under the name Daniel Whitfield. He filed a legal name change to Hale 6 months after the registration,
before the fund began its acquisitions." She watched Arthur's face as he read the paper, watched the particular stillness come over him that she had only seen twice before in 2 decades. Once during the divorce that had ended his marriage, and once briefly during the week the Whitfield acquisition closed 20 years ago, when for exactly 1 afternoon, Arthur Kane had looked like a man uncertain whether he'd won or lost something. "Get me everything," Arthur said finally, his voice very quiet. "Everything on Daniel Whitfield from birth to this morning. And Marguerite, I want this contained. No board notification, no filing until I decide how this is handled." Marguerite nodded and left, and Arthur sat alone with the paper for a long time, his mind moving backward through 20 years to a boy in the back row of a shareholder meeting, furious and silent, watching his father's life dismantled by men in suits who called it strategy. The emergency shareholder meeting had been scheduled for weeks, long before any of this had surfaced. A routine vote on a proposed merger clause that would restructure Kane Industries' relationship with 3 regional subsidiaries. The kind of procedural matter that ordinarily filled a conference room with half-attentive board members checking their phones. Daniel had planned months ago to attend under the cover of a minor institutional proxy, his presence unremarkable among the dozens of representatives filling the room. His vote cast quietly through Whitfield Holdings' registered agent, without ever requiring his own face to appear before Arthur Kane. That plan collapsed the moment his attorney called him Sunday night, voice tight with urgency, explaining that Kane's legal team had already traced the trust that Arthur knew or was one signature away from knowing everything, and that showing up in disguise now would only look like exactly the kind of cowardice Daniel had spent his whole life trying not to become. "If he's going to find out," Daniel said, slowly staring out his apartment window at the gray Sunday sky, Elena and Lily asleep in the next room. "And he's going to find out from me, standing in front of him. Not from a filing his lawyers dug up like I'm something to be exposed." He told Elena none of this on Sunday night, a decision he would spend the following week regretting bitterly. Though in the moment, it felt less like cowardice and more like a father's instinct to let his family have one more ordinary evening before everything changed. Pancakes for dinner because Lily had requested them. A board game, abandoned halfway through because Lily kept changing the rules in her own favor. Elena laughing so hard at the girl's shameless cheating that tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. And Daniel watching both of them with an ache in his chest that felt like grief for something he hadn't lost yet, but somehow already knew he would. He held Elena longer than usual when they said goodnight, and when she asked half-joking what had gotten into him, he only said that he loved her, and that whatever happened, he needed her to remember he'd meant it every single day. The Kane Industries boardroom on Monday morning filled slowly, the long glass table surrounded by institutional investors and family board members alike. The air thick with the particular tension of people who sensed something larger than the merger clause on the agenda, though none of them could yet say what. Elena arrived without an invitation, drawn by an instinct she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself, having woken that morning to find Daniel gone before dawn. A note on the kitchen table reading only, "I love you. Whatever you hear today, please remember that first," which had frightened her more than any confrontation could have. She stood at the back of the room, unnoticed by the board members who had once fawned over her as the heir apparent, and now regarded her, if they noticed her at all, as an inconvenient footnote to a family scandal. Arthur Kane took his seat at the head of the table, precisely at 9 Marguerite Voss at his right hand, and began the meeting with the practiced authority of a man who had run 100 such meetings without incident, moving through the procedural items with brisk efficiency until he reached the item concerning Whitfield Holdings' recently disclosed 19% stake, at which point he paused, looked up, and asked in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent room whether a representative of Whitfield Holdings was present to speak to the fund's intentions regarding the merger vote. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door at the back of the room opened and Daniel walked in. He wore a suit Elena had never seen before, dark and precisely tailored. Nothing like the worn blazer he kept for parent-teacher conferences, and he moved through the room with a composure that transformed him in the space of a dozen steps from the man Elena had married into someone she barely recognized. Not because his face had changed, but because the posture around it had the careful deference she'd always associated with him, replaced by something quieter and far more formidable. He stopped at the head of the table, opposite Arthur, and the room, sensing something enormous unfolding in real time, fell into absolute silence. "Good morning," Daniel said. "My name is Daniel Whitfield. I believe most of you know me as Daniel Hale. I'm the managing partner of Whitfield Holdings, and I control the 19% stake your legal team spent the last several weeks tracing." A murmur rippled through the board members, but Arthur Kane did not move, did not speak, his eyes fixed on Daniel's face with an expression Elena had never seen her father wear. Not anger, not even shock exactly, but something closer to recognition, arriving too late and too completely to be stopped. "Whitfield," Arthur said, and the name came out of him like something dragged up from underwater. "You're Robert's son." It was not a question. Daniel held his gaze without flinching. "I am," he said. "I've spent 6 years and every dollar I could raise assembling the position I hold in this company. I built it slowly enough that no one would connect it to my father's name until I decided the moment was right to stand in this room and tell you myself, rather than let your lawyers find it in a filing." Arthur's hands resting flat on the glass table had begun to tremble very slightly, a detail so unlike him that the board members nearest him exchanged uneasy glances. "Why?" Arthur said, and his voice had lost its customary command, reduced to something almost bare. "Why now? Why my daughter?" Daniel's composure cracked for the first time, something raw moving beneath the careful surface. "I didn't marry Elena to hurt you," he said. "I won't pretend that when I met her, some ugly part of me didn't recognize exactly whose daughter she was, and didn't wonder what it would mean to take something from you, the way you took everything from my father. I'm not proud of that thought, but it died the first month I knew her because I fell in love with her completely on her own terms, with no relation to you at all. I should have told her the truth the day I realized that. I told myself I was protecting her. The truth is, I was protecting myself because I was terrified that once she knew, she'd see exactly what you probably see right now. A man who used her." Elena, standing at the back of the room, felt the words land in her chest like something physical, each one confirming what she had feared and denied in equal measure for weeks. She did not step forward yet. She watched her father instead, watched the color drain from his face in increments, watched his hand rise unsteadily to grip the edge of the table, and understood with a clarity that arrived too late to prevent what happened next, that whatever guilt her father carried about Robert Whitfield had never actually been resolved, only buried under 20 years of success he'd built directly on top of it. And that the sight of Robert's son standing in this room, controlling a stake in the very empire built from his father's ruin, had finally cracked the foundation Arthur had spent 2 decades reinforcing. "I never meant..." Arthur started, his voice barely audible now, and then stopped, his face going gray in a way that made Marguerite Voss rise from her chair with sudden alarm. reaching for his shoulder just as his knees buckled and he collapsed sideways, catching the edge of the table on his way down. The room erupting into chaos around him, board members shouting for someone to call for help, chairs scraping back. Marguerite kneeling beside him with 2 fingers pressed to his throat, her composed voice cracking for the first time in 22 years as she called his name. Elena moved before she fully decided to, crossing the room in seconds, dropping to her knees beside her father's crumpled form, her hand finding his and gripping it with a desperation that erased for the moment every ounce of anger she'd carried since the night he disowned her.
"Dad," she said. "Dad, stay with me. Someone call an ambulance, please."
And above her dimly, she was aware of Daniel already on the phone, his voice steady and clear as he gave the address and the situation to emergency dispatch. The careful boardroom composure he'd walked in with, now entirely given over to plain, useful urgency. The paramedics arrived within 11 minutes, though, to Elena kneeling on the boardroom floor with her father's hand in hers. It felt like hours had passed, each one stretched thin with fear. She hadn't expected to feel for a man who had disowned her 3 weeks earlier. Arthur was conscious by the time they arrived, pale and disoriented but breathing, his vitals stable enough that the lead paramedic spoke in the calm, procedural tone of someone managing a serious but non-catastrophic event rather than a tragedy, though he insisted on immediate transport to the hospital for a full cardiac workup given Arthur's age and the suddenness of the collapse. Elena rode in the ambulance, still gripping her father's hand, while Daniel followed behind in a car with Marguerite Voss, the 2 of them sitting in tense silence, broken only once when Marguerite turned to him and asked quietly whether he'd known this confrontation might do exactly this to a man of Arthur's age and blood pressure history. Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low and honest, in a way that surprised even himself. "No," he said. "I came prepared for him to hate me. I wasn't prepared for him to look like a man finally seeing the ghost he'd spent 20 years running from." At the hospital, in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, Elena finally turned to Daniel, and the look on her face was not the fury he had braced himself for during the drive over, but something more exhausted and more complicated. Grief layered over grief, betrayal tangled with a love she couldn't simply switch off. Because the truth had finally surfaced. "You knew," she said. "This whole time. You knew what my father did to your family and you married me anyway. And you let me find out like this in a room full of strangers watching my father collapse in front of me." Daniel didn't attempt to defend himself with excuses. "I should have told you the first month," he said. "I told myself 100 reasons why waiting was protecting you. But the truth is, I was a coward, Elena. I was afraid that the moment you knew where I came from, you'd only ever see me as the man getting even with your father, instead of the man who fell in love with you, completely separately from all of that." Elena studied his face for a long moment, the exhaustion and honesty in it, the absence of any attempt to soften what he'd done, and felt something in her chest twist painfully between the urge to walk away and the deeper, more stubborn truth that she still loved him, even now, even furious, even uncertain whether the marriage she'd built could survive the wreckage of what had just happened in that boardroom. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Not to decide if I love you. I know I do. I need time to figure out if I can trust you again, because those aren't the same thing, and you of all people should understand the difference between loving someone and trusting them completely." Daniel nodded, accepting the distinction without argument, and reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her the choice of whether to take it. After a long moment, she did, though her grip remained loose. Provisional, a bridge extended, but not yet fully trusted to bear weight. Down the hallway, a doctor emerged from behind a set of double doors, removing a surgical mask, and called for the family of Arthur Kane. And Elena rose to meet him, Daniel a half step behind her, both of them walking now toward whatever news waited on the other side of those doors, toward a reckoning. Neither Kane nor Whitfield blood had managed to escape for 20 years, finally arriving all at once. The doctor's news was better than Elena had let herself hope for in the 11 minutes since the paramedics arrived, and worse than she wanted to admit out loud. A moderate cardiac event, not the massive attack that had killed Robert Whitfield 2 decades earlier, but serious enough that Arthur would need a stent placed within the hour and a recovery period afterward that no amount of money or willpower could shorten. "He's stable," the doctor said, removing his surgical cap, "and the prognosis is good if he follows the recovery plan we set. But I'll be honest with you, a man his age doesn't get many warnings like this." This was one. Elena thanked him with a voice that didn't quite sound like her own, and when the doctor disappeared back through the double doors, she sat down hard in one of the vinyl waiting room chairs and put her face in her hands, not crying exactly, just breathing, trying to absorb the fact that she had spent 3 weeks hating a man who had nearly died in front of her, and that hatred and grief could apparently occupy the exact same space in a person's chest without canceling each other out. Daniel sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to crowd the fragile provisional truce they'd struck an hour earlier. "Do you want me to go?" he asked quietly. "I don't want to make this harder by being here." Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I want my father to be okay. I want to be angry at you, and I want you to hold my hand at the same time, and I know that doesn't make sense. But I don't think anything about today is supposed to make sense." Daniel didn't try to argue her out of the contradiction. He simply stayed his hand resting near hers on the armrest between them, close enough to take if she wanted it, patient enough not to reach for it himself, and they sat together in that uncomfortable, unresolved space for the better part of 2 hours, while surgeons worked on the man who had 20 years apart, destroyed one family, and disowned a daughter for loving into the other. Marguerite Voss arrived at the hospital an hour into the wait, still dressed in the same tailored suit she'd worn to the boardroom, her usual composure visibly shaken. She sat across from Elena without asking permission, folding her hands in her lap, and for a long moment said nothing at all. "I've worked for your father for 22 years, she said finally. "I drafted the paperwork for the Whitfield acquisition myself, back when I was young enough to think efficiency was the same thing as virtue. I want you to know that I didn't recognize the name today until it was already too late to warn him. I should have recognized it years ago." Elena studied the older woman's face, the genuine guilt sitting there plainly, and found she had no appetite left for assigning blame to anyone else in the room. "You didn't put him in that hospital bed," she said. 20 years of not looking directly at what he'd done did that. Marguerite nodded slowly, accepting the assessment without argument, and the three of them sat together afterward in a silence that felt strangely less hostile than companionable 3 people bound by the same unfinished reckoning, waiting for the same set of doors to open. Arthur woke from the procedure, groggy and disoriented, tubes and monitors surrounding him in a hospital room that felt to a man who had controlled every room he'd ever entered, humiliatingly small. Elena was the first face he saw when the fog cleared enough to focus, sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, her expression unreadable in the way she'd inherited ironically from him. "You came," Arthur said, his voice rough and unfamiliar even to himself. "After everything, you came." Elena's jaw tightened. "You're my father," she said simply. "Disowning me didn't undo 28 years of being your daughter. It just made the last 3 weeks a lot lonelier than they needed to be." Arthur closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his face.
some armor loosened by proximity to his own mortality that no boardroom confrontation had managed to crack. "I need to tell you about Robert Whitfield," he said, "before I say anything else."
"You deserve to hear it from me, not from lawyers, not from your husband's carefully prepared statement in front of my board," he told her haltingly at first, and then with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to keep protecting himself. About the acquisition, 20 years earlier. The shell purchases the proxy votes quietly secured through favors and pressure. The bankruptcy filing that followed with an inevitability Arthur had once called strategy, and now, lying in a hospital bed with a stent in his artery, was willing to call by its truer name. "I told myself for 20 years that it was just business," he said. "That Robert Whitfield failed to see the maneuver coming, and that failure was his own fault, not mine. I never let myself think about what happened to his family afterward. I made sure I never let myself think about it, because thinking about it would have meant admitting I built half of what I have on top of another man's ruin." His voice cracked on the last word, an unfamiliar sound from a man Elena had never once, in her entire life, heard admit to a mistake he couldn't immediately spin into a lesson about strength. "When Daniel walked into that boardroom," Arthur continued, "and I understood who he was, it wasn't the money or the stake in my company, or even the fact that I'd let a Whitfield into this family without knowing it. It was seeing Robert's face on a grown man who had every right to hate me, and realizing I'd spent 20 years building an empire I couldn't actually look at directly, because somewhere underneath it was a debt I never paid." Elena listened without interrupting, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time in 3 weeks. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The recognition that her father's cruelty toward her marriage had never really been about Daniel's bank account at all, but about a fear so old and so carefully buried that Arthur himself had likely never fully understood its source until it was standing in front of him in a $5,000 suit, calling itself Whitfield. "You disowned me," she said finally, "because some part of you already sensed something was wrong with Daniel, didn't you? Not because he was poor, because he reminded you of something you didn't want to look at." Arthur nodded slowly, the movement clearly paining his chest, but seeming to matter more to him than the discomfort. "I told myself it was about protecting you from a man with no name," he said. "But you're right. There was something underneath that. I think I've been afraid of the name Whitfield for 20 years, without ever admitting it had a name at all." It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to a genuine apology her father had ever offered her, wrapped inside a confession rather than stated outright. But it was more honesty than she'd received from him in her entire adult life, and she found she was willing for now to accept it as a beginning rather than demand it arrive as a complete resolution. Daniel waited outside the room during this conversation, understanding without being told that this particular reckoning belonged to Elena and her father alone. And it was nearly an hour later, after the nurse had come through to check Arthur's vitals and insisted he rest, that Elena finally stepped back into the hallway and found Daniel exactly where she'd left him, standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the gray afternoon light fall over the parking structure outside. "He told me everything," she said. "About Robert, about the acquisition. He didn't try to make himself look better than he was." Daniel exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing, though not all of it. "How do you feel?" he asked, hearing it from him. Elena considered the question with more care than she'd given anything in weeks. "Angry," she admitted. "Sad. A little bit relieved, which feels strange to say about a story where everyone loses something. But mostly," she said, meeting his eyes directly now, "I keep thinking about the fact that you carried this alone for 6 years. that you built an entire second life just to get close enough to make him answer for what he did. And somewhere along the way, you fell in love with his daughter and didn't know what to do with that. And instead of telling me, you just kept carrying it alone every single day we were married.
I know, Daniel said.
I know that's not an excuse. I've had a long time to think about why I didn't tell you, and every reason I gave myself sounds smaller now than it did at the time. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself the timing was never right. But underneath both of those, if I'm honest, I was afraid that once you knew, you'd look at every good thing between us and wonder how much of it had been real and how much had been strategy. And I couldn't survive watching you look at me that way. So I kept delaying the moment you might have to. Elena studied him for a long moment, feeling the weight of the last 3 weeks and the last several hours pressing down on her at once. Her father's collapse, his confession, Daniel's own long-carried guilt, Lily's crayon drawing still taped to their refrigerator with 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun.
I need you to understand something, she said finally.
I'm not angry that you're Robert Whitfield's son. I'm not even angry really that you wanted to make my father answer for what he did. I understand that better now than I did this morning. I'm angry that you decided on your own that I couldn't handle the truth, that you made yourself the only person allowed to carry that weight instead of trusting me enough to carry some of it with you. Daniel absorbed this without flinching, recognizing the accuracy of it, even as it cost him something to hear. You're right, he said simply. I didn't trust you with it. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I think I was protecting the version of myself I'd built with you. The engineer, the husband, the father to Lily, who didn't carry 20 years of unpaid debt behind his eyes. I liked that version of myself more than the one standing in boardrooms, plotting a slow reckoning.
I didn't want to bring that man home to you. Elena felt something in her chest soften slightly at the honesty of it, though she didn't yet reach for his hand.
I'm not going anywhere, she said carefully. I want you to understand that first, because I think you need to hear it before anything else I'm about to say. But I need you to promise me something, and I need you to mean it completely, not just say it to make this conversation easier. Daniel nodded, waiting. No more separate lives, Elena said.
Not the good version you show me, and the complicated version you carry alone.
If something is hard or ugly or unfinished, I need you to bring it home instead of protecting me from it. I signed away my father's entire fortune because I believed I was choosing a partnership, not a performance. I need the partnership to be real all the way through, even the parts that are difficult to say out loud.
I promise, Daniel said. And this time his voice didn't carry the smooth, practiced quality it had in the boardroom, or even the careful composure he'd maintained through most of their marriage. It cracked slightly, the way it had at their county clerk's office wedding, on the word, always. And Elena recognized in that small imperfection something she trusted more completely than any polished reassurance he could have offered. She reached for his hand then, and this time her grip wasn't provisional. Wasn't a bridge extended cautiously. It was a decision made with full knowledge of everything that had come before it. And Daniel closed his fingers around hers, like a man finally allowed to set down something he'd carried alone for far too long. Arthur Kane's recovery took 6 weeks, during which he was, for the first time in Elena's memory, forced by his own body into a stillness he had never permitted himself in decades of relentless motion. He used the enforced quiet, to Elena's genuine surprise, not to plot his return to full control of Kane Industries, but to have long, halting conversations with his daughter in his hospital room, and later his study, conversations that circled repeatedly back to Robert Whitfield, to the son-in-law Arthur had once dismissed as nothing, and eventually
tentatively, to Lily, whom Arthur met for the first time 3 weeks into his recovery when Elena brought the girl to visit, uncertain how her father would react to a 6-year-old who called Daniel Dad and Elena Mom, with the easy confidence of a child who had never known anything but love from either of them. Arthur had watched Lily color quietly at his bedside table for nearly 20 minutes before finally asking gruffly whether she wanted to see a magic trick, and produced a coin from behind her ear with the same practiced precision he'd once used to close $100 million deals. Lily shrieked with delight and demanded he do it again, and then again, until a nurse gently reminded them that Mr. Kane needed to rest, and Elena, watching from the doorway, felt something in her chest ease, for the first time in over a month, watching her father choose deliberately to build something, instead of simply defending what he already had. The reconciliation was not complete, and Elena made a point of never pretending to herself or to Daniel that it was. Arthur remained at his core a man more comfortable with control than with vulnerability, and there were setbacks in the months that followed, moments when his old instinct to manage rather than to trust resurfaced. A proposed business arrangement with Whitfield Holdings that Arthur initially structured to favor Kane Industries so heavily that Daniel's attorney flatly refused it, forcing a renegotiation that took weeks and more than one tense phone call. There was an afternoon 2 months into his recovery when Arthur showed up unannounced at the apartment with a real estate agent in tow, having quietly arranged a viewing for a brownstone in a better neighborhood, and Elena had to sit her father down at the same kitchen table where Daniel once did his midnight calculations, and explain patiently but firmly that they would move when they were ready to move, on their own terms, and not a day sooner because he found the laundromat beneath them unbearable. Arthur had gone quiet for a long moment, then nodded and canceled the viewing himself that same afternoon, a small concession that cost him visibly, but that he made anyway. But something had genuinely shifted beneath the surface of Arthur Kane's carefully maintained authority. A willingness, however imperfect, to be corrected, to apologize when he overstepped, to sit through Sunday dinners at the small apartment above the laundromat and eat off mismatched plates without complaint, learning slowly what it meant to be present in a family rather than simply presiding over one. He learned Lily's favorite cartoon. He learned to stop bringing wine that cost more than the meal itself. He learned slowly and with visible effort to ask Daniel questions about his work, the real work, the water treatment consulting, instead of only ever discussing Whitfield Holdings' position in his company. And the first time he did it over a Sunday roast in October, Daniel had looked so genuinely surprised that Elena had to hide her smile behind her napkin. 6 months after the boardroom collapse, Kane Industries and Whitfield Holdings announced a restructured partnership, one that returned meaningful operational control to the Whitfield Family Trust. As a form of restitution, Arthur insisted on structuring himself over the objections of board members who called it an unnecessary concession to a stake Kane Industries could have fought to dilute through other legal means. Some debts, Arthur told his board in a statement that made its way eventually into an industry publication that Elena kept clipped in a drawer for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Don't disappear just because you have the legal power to ignore them. I spent 20 years discovering that the hard way, and I'd rather pay what I owe honestly than keep pretending the debt was never real. It was not, Elena reflected, reading the clipping months later. An apology exactly. It was something more useful than an apology, an accounting offered publicly by a man who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly that kind of exposure. Daniel, for his part, folded Whitfield Holdings' restored position into a foundation named for his father, funding water infrastructure projects in underserved communities across the same 3 states where Robert Whitfield had once built his modest, earnest company before Arthur Kane's ambitions swallowed it whole. He kept his consulting work too unwilling to give up the parts of his life that had never been about strategy or inheritance. And Elena watched him stand at groundbreaking ceremonies in hard hats far more often than in tailored boardroom suits, looking each time more like the man she had fallen in love with above a laundromat in Queens than the composed stranger who had walked into that boardroom 6 months earlier. At the first groundbreaking, Arthur attended without being asked, standing quietly at the back of a small crowd of local officials and construction workers. And when a reporter asked him why Kane Industries chairman would show up to a modest municipal ribbon cutting, Arthur answered simply that some things mattered more than headlines, and left it at that. On the 1-year anniversary of the dinner where Arthur had disowned her, Elena stood in the small apartment kitchen, now slightly less cramped since they'd finally saved enough to add a second bedroom for Lily, watching Daniel help their daughter frost a cake that read in Lily's own wobbly hand, "Happy divorce from Grandpa's rules." A joke the girl had insisted on despite not fully understanding it, simply because it made both her parents laugh until they cried the first time she suggested it. Arthur arrived for dinner that evening, in a car far less ostentatious than the ones he used to favor, carrying a bottle of wine, and more importantly arriving on time, a small courtesy that had once seemed beneath him, and now Elena understood represented something he'd worked hard to learn. He brought, too, a small wrapped box for Lily, and inside it, a simple gold locket. Nothing like the extravagant jewelry Elena remembered from childhood birthdays, engraved on the back with the words "For the family we choose to keep." Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep and Arthur had gone home, Elena and Daniel sat together on the narrow couch where they'd spent so many early evenings of their marriage, the radiator clanking its familiar rhythm in the background, and Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and unhidden now in a way it hadn't been a year earlier. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "what would have happened if you told me the truth on our first date instead of 8 months later, in the worst possible way?" Daniel considered the question seriously, his hand moving slowly through her hair. "I used to wonder that constantly," he admitted. "Now I think I'd rather have the truth we ended up with, messy and late and nearly disastrous, than a version where I told you everything perfectly and never had to prove the hard way that I meant it when I promised to stop carrying things alone." Elena smiled against his chest, feeling for the first time since that terrible dinner a year earlier that the family she'd built wasn't a consolation for the one she'd lost, but something sturdier, chosen deliberately and rebuilt honestly. Strong enough now to hold both the Kane name and the Whitfield one, without either family needing to disown the other ever again. Outside, the city moved on in its usual indifferent rhythm, cars passing below the window, the laundromat's sign humming its familiar orange glow up through the glass. And inside, in the small apartment that had once felt like exile, and now felt simply like home, 2 families finally sat down together, imperfect and unfinished, but no longer divided by a secret either of them had to carry alone.